Welcome to our Akuhoai webinar series, and I'm very excited to introduce you and get going on this panel discussion on student loneliness. But before I do that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Linda Wiley, and I am the Director of Online Learning and work as a part of the educational team here at Akuhoai. Before we get started, I am going to highlight a couple of our programs that are coming up. You should be seeing our website. And anytime you go to our website and look at our upcoming events, then you will see a whole calendar of programs. And as an example, we have a program later this week from our research committee on turning data into stories that matter. So you can sign up for that directly on our website. I'm also going to take you over to our biggie coming up, and that is Campus Home Live. If you have a chance to come to Campus Home Live, I really encourage you to take advantage. We are going to be down in Orlando, Florida this year, so come join us at Disney, at the Marriott World Center. It's going to be a great time, and we hope to see you there. But for today's program, student well-being can impact the ability to acclimate, form relationships, build community, and thrive as a student. There are many factors that can impact well-being and can lead to loneliness, feeling disconnected, or withdrawing completely from campus and residence life. I'm excited today to have a discussion with you all that discusses the latest research on student loneliness and overall well-being. Initiatives can address the root causes of loneliness and also how student initiatives can have a positive impact on well-being and engagement. So I'm going to ask our guest to introduce themselves. If you have questions throughout the program, please just put them either in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A. At some point, if you want to come off mute and ask your question, we can definitely make that happen. This program and many of our webinars are recorded, and so this will also be available after today, probably by the end of the week, that you can come back and watch and hopefully share with some of your colleagues. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Jason Lynch, who is going to kick us off with introductions.
Awesome. Thank you for that. My name is Dr. Jason Lynch. I'm an associate professor of higher education and student affairs at Appalachian State University. I'm also a proud Akuhuai intern alum out at UC Berkeley and spent a number of years as a practitioner in housing and residence life in both resident director and assistant director roles. So I'm excited to be here and thank you. Maybe I'll throw the ball over to Marky.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marky Pasternak. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Senior Manager of Higher Education at Active Minds. We are the nation's leading nonprofit for mobilizing youth and young adults around mental health. We primarily got our start in college and universities, but we are now in the K through 12 sector as well as out in communities. And so I'm excited to be here today. We've worked with Akuhuai for a number of years now, especially through the Behavioral Wellness Institute. And so excited to talk on this important topic and even just learn from colleagues about how residence professionals can really help in this space as well. Should I throw the ball? I'm going to throw it over to Allison.
Thanks, Marky. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here today. My name is Allison Cornett, and I am the Director of Research at Trellis Strategies. If you don't know us, Trellis Strategies is a nonprofit research and technical assistance firm that partners with students, colleges, and universities to better understand and elevate the college student experience. So our work really works to combine quantitative and qualitative research to help organizations use data to inform their strategy, program design, and policy, particularly related to student success, wellness, and basic needs. And I'm really excited about this conversation today. I think it's so important for us to look at well-being among college students holistically, not as an individual shortcoming or something that we should be placing on the individual, but something that's really deeply influenced by institutional structures, policies, and systems. So I'm excited for the conversation, and I'll pass it over to Carson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carson Domi. I serve as the Executive Director of the Coalition for Student Wellbeing. We're an organization that seeks to improve mental health within higher education through advocacy, collaboration, and education. I'm also a senior at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'll pass it off to my friend Dylan Gorel.
I'm Dylan. I'm a sophomore at Georgetown University studying English, and I'm on the pre-law track. And I work for Carson at the Coalition for Student Wellbeing as the coordinator of op-eds and student content.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I figured what we could do. I'm serving as your moderator today. I'm gonna just introduce our topic a little bit, kind of set the stage, and kind of introduce some factoids, perhaps. Right. I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. I'm going to throw the ball over to Allison after that to talk a little bit more in depth about their particular survey and some of the data that came out of that, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time fielding some questions amongst the panel. We're going to kind of talk about lived experience and asking for practical insights kind of based off of that. Does that sound good to everybody? Wonderful. Awesome. Well, I'm going to share my screen because it's not a webinar without a PowerPoint, right? So this is our introduction slide, impact of loneliness on student well-being. But what I'd like to ask you all in the audience, right? I want you to think about a time in your life where you felt particularly lonely. And in one word, what was that experience like for you? And if you're at your computer and able to, maybe put that word in the chat feature if you don't mind. Maybe our panelists, if you want to participate in that as well. Think about that time that maybe you felt lonely and what did it feel like, or what was that experience like for you? Sad, scary, empty, isolating, depressing, misunderstood, depressed. Yeah. I know whenever I was experiencing or do experience that still sometimes, right? It kind of feels like you're disconnected from others, right? As you're on an island. Yeah, demotivating, Allison said in there. Sometimes it might feel like it's going to go on forever too, right? Like it's that sometimes we forget that loneliness it can be a passing thing, right? It can feel like we're stuck in those modes. Well, considering though that loneliness is kind of a universal experience, we also know that it's becoming a silent epidemic, right? We know that in 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General actually said that we need to be paying a lot more attention to this as a global or a countrywide epidemic here in the U.S. Well, what is loneliness? It's probably important that we define this if we're going to be talking about this and sharing some ideas. Well, when you look at the research, a lot of it kind of centers around this type of definition. So you can think of loneliness as a subjective, distressing state of mind characterized by a perceived lack of meaningful social connections, often felt as isolation or emotional emptiness, regardless of being physically alone or surrounded by people. It is a negative experience driven by a discrepancy between desired and actual social relationships. So I've highlighted and underlined some key points to this, right? So loneliness isn't, or it can also often be misperceived as you're literally physically alone somewhere, right? But more often than not, when folks are experiencing loneliness, they're surrounded by people, even in the work environment, right? Whether it's our colleagues or student staff, even beyond our students, right? We can be surrounded by people all day and still feel like we are on our own little island. And particularly in the U.S., our culture kind of drives this, right? We are all this go, go, go. There's often not a lot of time for authentic engagement with each other. We're always working towards some sort of goal, and it's hard to sit down and build those connections. I know I'm pushing 40 this year, and the older I get, the more I'm kind of like, oh, like it's just hard to make friends as an adult, right? And I remember back in college, like it was a little bit more structured. And so I often think about that. Working in student affairs and watching my graduate students and all of that, it's an interesting reflection to think about. When we think about loneliness, there's some fast facts I wanted to talk with you about. So, Marky probably is familiar with this particular statistic, considering that I saw that it was on the Active Minds website, right? So, in a study that they cited, 65% of college students reported feeling lonely. And when you kind of look at the aggregate of different studies on this, the numbers holds pretty true. It's as low as 50%, which isn't low, right? That's half of college students reporting feeling lonely a consistent amount of time. Interestingly, right, so some studies show that students reporting higher levels of loneliness are also 2 to 3 times more likely to also report depression. So a lot of my research deals with trauma and well-being in college campuses, whether it's staff or students. And that's one thing we really see in the research bears out, right, that folks that are experiencing distressing mental health experiences also carry this loneliness about them, right? Depression kind of makes you feel, if you've ever seen that movie, Inside Out, it's a wonderful movie to kind of depict emotions, right? And whenever the sort of the depression emotion kind of emerges, the main character withdraws, right? There's it feels like there's walls all around. So it really makes sense that these two kind of go hand in hand. And finally, kind of specific to the college environment, emerging studies are showing that loneliness is actually linked to lower academic engagement and persistence, with some evidence that those experiencing loneliness are 1.5 to 2 times higher or at higher risk to withdraw from classes or the institution to begin with. And we're seeing a lot of that come out right in this post-pandemic environment when we're talking a lot of concern about student engagement on campuses and in class. Well, why does this matter in housing, right? Everybody lives in the dorms or in the residence halls together. Like, of course, they're not lonely. They're surrounded by people. They probably live with 3 other people in a very confined space. But right, kind of going back to that original definition, it doesn't matter. There still needs to be some curated effort put into combating loneliness. So obviously, residence halls shape relationships and belonging. We've known that for a long time, those of us that worked in the profession, right? But specifically, what that does, like being in a residence hall, introduces daily interaction patterns. You see the same folks over and over again. There's opportunity in that. There's access to informal connections, just passing somebody in the hallway, right? And norms of belonging and engagement. You start to kind of learning how to be in community with people, and a lot of times our residence directors or resident assistants are the ones that are helping develop students to learn those skills. But one thing that I commonly hear and one thing I commonly experience, right, is students don't show up. And we just scratch our heads as to why, right? Well, when you actually kind of like bear this out and think about this, right? So students avoid high effort and socially risky environments. But it's not just students. We all do this. Like, if I'm asked to show up to a place by myself and I'm supposed to be socially interacting, and there's a lot of effort that goes into it, but there's a high risk of embarrassment or me putting my foot in my mouth or something, I'm probably going to avoid that. Even as an adult, I will do that, right? So the same for students in the college environment. Students prefer low pressure drop in or observational entry points, right? They want to kind of scope out the scene. It's about safety. A lot, like I said, a lot of my research is about trauma. And one of the key insights around trauma, right, is it affects our sense of safety. And if we're entering into environments where we're already not feeling safe, we're either going to avoid it or we want a chance to kind of calm down and kind of scope out the scene. And then finally, students are navigating reduced confidence in face-to-face interactions, right? We think about the COVID generation, right? There was lots of folks that are entering college now that spend a lot of their high school or middle school days locked in a room or in their house. A lot of those key developmental points in students' lives just weren't there. And oftentimes in the way college works, right, we are told to meet them where they're at. We're told to meet students where they're at, right? And so sometimes that can get confusing in that, all right, well, if students are online and students are engaging in social media, we need to meet them over there. But that could be a little bit of a catch-22, right? So if we're wanting them to develop to have more in-person social interaction and reduce that loneliness, there's got to be some challenge in that we have to balance. And again, even decades later, we know that traditional housing residence life programs tend to assume that students are ready for structured social engagement, right? So yeah, we're gonna like have them come in and start doing these deep dialogue talks in a residence hall with people that they might have only seen once or twice, or yeah, we're gonna bring them to this like pizza social where we're gonna set pizza out and then say just go talk to each other, right? And expect good things to just magically happen. But that's not how it works, right? We know that motivation precedes connection. Like they need to have a vested interest in like why does this matter? What is the motivation to connect in these environments? And sometimes we also assume that one size approach to community fits everybody, and we know that's not the case. People come from different backgrounds. They have different motivations. They've had different experiences with social environments, and we need to take those into account when we're building opportunities to connect. And I'm going to wrap up before I hand this over to Allison, and we'll kind of circle our way back to this and bookend it. But how can we reframe how we're doing our work in HRL based off of the research, right? So one, context matters. We know that things like institution type, it could be really easy for a student at a large R1 to just lose themselves. But we shouldn't automatically assume that our small colleges that students are all plugged in and connected. As we keep repeating, it's not necessarily about the physical presence of people around you. It's about the quality of that presence. We know that connection often follows repeated low stakes exposure, right? So it's not about one and done programming. How are we creating consistent low stakes opportunities for students to connect in meaningful ways? Weak ties and casual interactions are really critical entry points. So it kind of keeps going into this theme of low stakes, but what that means, right, is that they don't have to put a lot of investment in it, right? We're building up to vulnerability. We're building up to deeper conversations and familiarity. And so belonging also develops through proximity and familiarity, right? So we know that, at least whenever I was a resident director, I would always tell my RAs, I was like, a sign of a healthy hall, right, is doors open. We had a traditional sort of hall setup, right? And so I was like, if we're doing hall walks and everything, if we're seeing that folks are leaving their doors open and chit-chatting, to me, that's a good indicator that folks are not just in proximity, but are becoming familiar with each other. And then finally, kind of repeating it, right? Consistency builds connection more reliably than intensity. So it's less about putting on these big, extravagant programs in the residence hall and hoping that 100 people show up. It's more about the low effort, small connections, but they're happening over and over and over again to create that safety for folks. So I'm going to stop talking and throw the ball over to Allison. Allison, I believe you're able to share screen as well if you have slides, but I will be quiet and let you take over the show.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Jason, for setting the stage so beautifully for our discussion today. So really quickly, I'll just start by sharing a little bit about the data source for my research, which is our flagship survey at Trellis Strategies, the Student Financial Wellness Survey, or SFWS. We know it's a mouthful. The SFWS is a self-reported online survey of college students across the country that captures financial well-being, basic need security, mental health, and related indicators of student success. So the Student Financial Wellness Survey is totally free for colleges and universities to participate in. Each participating institution gets a detailed report on their students, along with a de-identified data file that they can use to inform programs, initiatives, and seek funding from grants or foundations. Next slide, please. Perfect. So before we get into the SFWS findings, I just wanted to briefly share some metrics from our last implementation to kind of help us set the context here. So these findings that we'll talk about today reflect responses from nearly 66,000 undergraduate students across 153 institutions, including 104 two-year colleges and 49 four-year universities. The total survey population included more than 845,000 students, with our response rates hovering around 8% and completion rates above 80%. We also weight the data to ensure that it represents participating institutions and we can have a little bit more confidence in the numbers.
So Allison, we have a quick question. Is this for U.S. institutions only?
Currently, yes. We will provide you, if you want to field the survey on your own campus, we will give you the instrument We love to see the results. We've done that before for institutions in Brazil and Canada. And so if that's something you're interested in, I can provide you with a Qualtrics file and also a survey instrument. But unfortunately, we're not quite in kind of an international settings just yet. Okay, perfect. So today I'll be drawing on analysis from about 58,000 of these respondents who answered our loneliness question, with a special focus on disparities with their experiences of loneliness and other wellness areas, as well as links between loneliness and symptoms of anxiety and depression. And throughout the presentation, I'll be kind of comparing two groups of students: lonely students, so those who told us they feel lonely either sometimes or always, and then non-lonely students, those who say they rarely or never feel lonely. And a lot of this might seem familiar and kind of really shows the commonality of those numbers that Dr. Lynch shared earlier. So in our survey, we found that over half of students experience loneliness on a regular basis. And specifically in fall 2025, we saw 57% of our surveyed students report that they always or sometimes feel lonely. So to break that down a little bit further, we saw about 46% say that they feel lonely sometimes, and more than 1 in 10, 11% said that they feel lonely always. And then kind of on the flip end of this, only 15% of these students reported that they never feel lonely. And we also looked at whether this varied by the type of institution, and it really didn't much. We saw students at two-year colleges were about as likely to feel lonely as students at four-year universities. So the kind of phenomena of loneliness is pretty applicable across both sectors of higher ed. And then on this side, I'm a huge data nerd, so I just want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into how students who report feeling lonely are also experiencing other key wellness indicators. So in this table, we have 3 columns of respondents: lonely students, non-lonely, and then overall. And you can really see pretty clearly that loneliness rarely exists on its own. And when I was looking at this data and preparing for this webinar today, I think one of the most striking relationships I found was between loneliness and basic needs. Compared to their non-lonely peers, these lonely students were consistently more likely to experience basic needs insecurity, as well as symptoms of anxiety and depression. And just looking at these numbers here, a lot of these gaps are pretty substantial. So when we look at food insecurity, lonely students were reporting food insecurity at rates 20 percentage points higher than their non-lonely students. And then these disparities become even more striking when we look at mental health. So using the GAD-2 and the PHQ-2, which are just short form validated scales that kind of function as screeners for likelihood of anxiety and depression, we saw that lonely students were nearly 3 times as likely to report symptoms of anxiety and exactly 4 times as likely to report symptoms of depression. So the kind of key point of this table here is to really drive home that loneliness often compounds other vulnerabilities. And our data and the data of many other similar surveys and researchers doing this work suggests that students who might be dealing with discrimination, financial hardship, or even lack of family support are going to be more likely to feel isolated than their peers. And we can see this pattern continue in lonely students' responses to the USDA 6-item food security scale, which we use to gauge kind of a level of food security that the students are experiencing at the time of the survey in October and November. So this would have been October, November 2025. And we saw alarmingly high levels of food insecurity among this lonely group, with about half saying that they couldn't afford balanced meals. More than 4 in 10 had bought food that didn't last and had no money to get more. And then we also saw substantial levels of reduced food intake, with students cutting their portion sizes, eating less than they felt they should. And then I think most concerningly here, a third were hungry but did not eat because there wasn't enough food. So these indicators all kind of show that for many lonely students, food insecurity is frequent, disruptive, and ongoing. And all this can further limit their opportunities for social connection and engagement on campus. And then my next focus area here is housing insecurity, which can include, as we all know, unstable housing arrangements, difficulty paying for their rent or utilities, or simply lacking a safe place to stay. And this slide kind of shows us how housing instability shows up for these lonely students. And while the percentages here are lower than what we see for food insecurity, it's still significant and potentially consequential for these lonely students. So we saw that 1 in 5 reported a rent or mortgage increase that was difficult to pay, and then others described either having difficulty paying for their utilities, moving in with others due to financial problems, and then leaving their households because they felt unsafe. And then kind of switching us over from need to access, I just want to emphasize the main takeaway from those last two slides, which is that loneliness and basic needs issues are deeply connected. And just remember that a student who is isolated might also be a student who is hungry. And that really underlines why holistic support services, those that can address financial, academic, and social needs, are just so critical for these students. And now just a quick pivot here on a check-in on mental health service awareness for lonely versus non-lonely students. Oh, sorry, Linda, can we go back to the last slide? So even when these mental health services are available for students, we know that awareness and utilization are not guaranteed. And we saw that in the data where only 1 in 4 of our lonely students did not know that their institution offered mental health resources, which is slightly higher than the rate among their non-lonely peers. And then next slide. Perfect. And I only have 2 slides left, or 3 slides left. So this is just going to broaden our lens a little bit beyond currently enrolled students to a recent survey that we did with individuals who had stopped out of post-secondary education. So this is another self-reported online survey where we collected more than 3,100 responses across 58 institutions of students who have stopped out or left their prior institution without finishing their credential, degree, or program. And this data kind of gives us an important opportunity to examine how emotional, social, and mental health factors are influencing these students' decision-making. Next slide. Perfect. So in the survey, we asked former students to explain their reasons for leaving their former institution. And one of the top broad categories was personal reasons. But within that, we kind of saw mental health and social factors loom large. Among those who cited personal reasons for leaving, 30% said that feeling isolated or alone was a major factor in their decision to leave college. And nearly 3 in 5, so 58% of these students reported dealing with emotional or mental health issues at the time that they decided to stop out. And then I always like to highlight student voices in our work. And I think hearing directly from students who have struggled with loneliness can be really powerful. So these are 2 responses that we received from students who participated in that Some College No Credential survey. And this top student said that they had left their prior college because they wanted to be closer to home and that they weren't able to join organizations or make any friends at their institution. So they were feeling isolated. And another student described their experience this way. I didn't feel fit in. I felt alone and isolated. I didn't feel like I belonged. The tuition was higher than what I could afford. I worked 2 jobs and felt it wasn't worth it anymore, and I didn't have any help available. So these voices might be a little bit heartbreaking, but they're super important for us to hear. And this can all remind us that behind every one of these statistics that I just covered and that Jason was sharing earlier, behind every statistic is a real student story. And this also really highlights for me how loneliness can amplify other issues like working long hours or being away from home, all of which can make a student feel that college just isn't the right place for them. And we all have a role in changing that narrative for our current and future students.
Thank you, Allison. So, what I figured we'd do before we dive into some structured panel questions, I want to first kind of ask our 3 others, Carson, Dylan, and Marky, like what kind of meaning are you starting to make from the presentation that Allison just gave, and from your perspective of either being a student or working from students, like how do you see student voice showing up and combating some of this?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think it's a surprise. I know when Trellis did the surveying, is glad to have that data from the point of the work that we're doing at the coalition of, it speaks to this being a real thing. I think people tangentially know that this is an issue on college campuses and it's prevalent, but to have the data on just how prevalent, I think has been incredibly helpful in terms of talking to policymakers at both the campus level, but then also, different governmental entities. And in terms of, I think the student voice piece of it, I think it makes a lot of student leaders and some of the work that we do at the coalition kind of look in the mirror of how we can seek to innovate. I think is really where the opportunity is of addressing kind of the social and technological climate that we're in, not just in higher education, but as a country as a whole. And I think education has a lot of adapting to do. And I think in terms of seeking to look at where to start in terms of fostering a more inclusive, welcoming, and kind of home campus. I think it starts with a lot of people in positions of positions like yours, residential life. It's one of the largest pieces of daily life for most college students, and so glad for the opportunity to be here because I think there's a lot of innovation to be done in terms of addressing student loneliness and well-being and belonging on college campuses.
Can go next. So I think the data is really on point with what we're seeing here at Active Minds too. So particularly in my role, one of my biggest roles with Active Minds is running our newer program called the Mental Health Advocacy Institute, and it's a year-long program for college students. Um, and we select 70 to 80 of them every year. And the first semester of the program, they create a steering committee on their campus, and they select an issue around mental health that they see that is prevalent on their campus, and then select an evidence-based strategy to address that issue, write a plan, and then put it into action the second semester of the program. And so, looking at our data that we're getting back from this year's cohort of the Institute, students and their steering committees, they can select any issue relevant to mental health they want to. We don't give them a suite of issues. We don't give them options to choose from. They just choose based on what they're seeing at their school. And, you know, we had 7 students choose loneliness. And I know 7 sounds like a small number, but when we're talking about 70 students from colleges across the country that they can choose any issue, so like hundreds of issues could be chosen, 7 of them choosing the same issue that I don't know would have been picked 10 years ago. Like I don't know if we would have seen it show up. And it was the third most picked issue. It was second only to underutilization of mental health resources on campus and to prevalence of mental health issues on campus. So students having anxiety or depression or something. Loneliness was number 3. So we're seeing students want to tackle this issue and saying to themselves, I think I could address this. I think I have an idea of what I could do to make a difference around this issue. And so I think what I love about the Trellis data is that it shows that the issue of loneliness is multifaceted, but also prevalent everywhere. So the pointing out the key piece of, hey, this is happening at community colleges and at four-year institutions. And we also see this being a really prevalent issue among students that face food insecurity or basic need insecurity. I think is starting to highlight and dig into the problem. But we are seeing students at Active Minds really care about this issue and come up with some really great strategies to address it that are evidence-based and some really unique things. And I'm happy to go into that either now or later. But yeah, they're doing some good work.
And I guess to throw my hat in the ring for a second there. So my main on-campus involvement at Georgetown is in this club called Men in Conversation. I'm the vice president of it. And what we do is we go within the community and outside in the greater DC community, try and formulate dialogue, conversation between and among young men, specifically, whether they're incarcerated men in the community or just guys on campus, freshmen through seniors, and even in the graduate community a little bit, and how we can kind of break this this issue of loneliness and isolation, but specifically for men who I'm sure anyone who's done a little bit of research will find that men struggle talking a little bit more than women. That's not to isolate anybody's experience at all, but that's just kind of the demographic we're working with. And I think in my experience, I've had a lot of guys come up to me, and a lot of guys when we do our intakes, things like that, because one thing we do as well is we're very clear that I'm not a therapist in any way, shape, or form. Nobody on the board is like that at all. We do trainings and things like that to make sure that we can spot it when somebody does need help. But the point being that we do like intakes and things like that sometimes, because if we suspect that somebody is in like need of real help beyond just kind of communal connectivity, then we can refer them to someone. But the crux of that being actually that I'd say 90% of the guys who join just need friends, just need some guys to hang out with, some guys that are like, oh, hey, we're in a club together. Let's go get food. Or, hey, we're in a club together. I know you. Let's go like see a sports game this weekend. And I think that most of what can be said about depression and anxiety is really closely linked to just needing a friend, just needing a few friends, just needing some people that I can say like, hey, like, you know me, I know you, can we talk? And that's not always can we talk about emotions and really deep things. Sometimes that's just knowing that somebody around, a big city like this knows you, somebody like gets you, somebody takes some stock in you. So I think just building those communities are kind of the first step to breaking down loneliness in my experience, but are also some of the trickiest things. Like that Trellis data suggests that people have a hard time going into those like high pressure situations socially. So it's kind of just a matter of how people in things like student affairs and residential living can encourage students to keep seeking out those avenues.
Definitely. Well, so Zakai in the Q&A had a great question that I think kind of lends into particularly what you were just saying, Dylan, too. So Zakai asked, I'm wondering how can I support RAs in having this conversation with residents? And so one thing that I'll add before I uh, leave it to the panelist is remembering that, right, our RAs are also these students that we're talking about. And so as y'all are kind of formulating your answers, like how um, maybe a both and, like how do RAs do this, but how do we also support RAs who might be experiencing loneliness? And how are we doing this in a way that doesn't feel contrived, right? Like we don't want RAs going to be like, you look lonely, like tell me about that, right? Like how do we do this in a more authentic way?
I can start. So I think Active Minds, we explored this topic specifically a couple years ago when we launched our new tool, Ask. It is an acronym that stands for Acknowledge, Support, Keep in Touch, and we call it the Stop, Drop, and Roll of emotional support. We found that through a survey that we did, sponsored by MTV, back in 2023 that 70% of young adults or college students said they did not know how to support a friend if they needed help with like a mental health sort of issue or provide emotional support rather. They didn't know how to emotionally support a friend. And when we talk about this, I just want to be clear, we're not talking about suicide prevention. We're not talking about crisis intervention of any sort. We're talking about emotional support, like basic emotional support. My friend is having a bad day. Maybe just flunked a test, maybe just got broken up with, maybe he's having a roommate issue. Like these things are coming up, and I'm not quite sure how to emotionally support this person. And that's why we created ASK, which the acronym stands for Acknowledge, Support, Keep in Touch. And it's these three basic steps that students can follow to emotionally support a peer. And I can send the website over too so folks can look at it. But we have an interactive website and a YouTube video that is, free and accessible for everybody that students can go through and practice emotionally supporting somebody. And so, what I really enjoy about Ask is that students have a space to click the wrong answer when it comes to emotionally supporting somebody. And to be honest with you all, some of these answers are not intuitive. Like when I look at the options of what should I say to Luna, all of the answers sound good in some fashion. But the product will tell you why that is not the most supportive thing to say, or how it could be misconstrued, or why it might put the spotlight on you instead of on them, or focus too much on solving the problem or fixing rather than being and things like that. So it's a really great way to learn emotional intelligence, and I think and emotional support. And I think we saw that students really had a need for that. They were like, "Hey, I want to be there. I want to help my friends. I just don't know how to do that." And the last thing I'll say is that that last step, the K, keep in touch, we found is really important because students felt that other ways of providing emotional support that had been provided to them before, even by Active Minds, didn't feel as genuine without the keep in touch piece. And I think that gets to what Dylan's saying too about these men wanting a community and friends to talk to and things like that. Is that like you can provide emotional support all day, but if you don't follow up with the person, they never hear from you again. It can only go so far. There's a genuineness in sending a text the next day, in making a plan for lunch, or inviting somebody to a low stakes social situation during which that they know they have somebody to go with, and you're going to keep having that conversation as they start to build themselves back up from whatever situation had happened.
Dylan, I would maybe call you out for a second because I think it kind of was directly talking about what you're doing in your community. Like, how do you help your peers or yourself? Like, how do you start having these conversations without it feeling forced or contrived?
Yeah, sure. I think like the most obvious thing is the way we present ourselves, right? It's to some extent the way I interact with the world is marketing, right? Like I wear a suit and tie today in the sense that I want people to perceive me well. Just as when I'm out and about filling my roles as vice president of this club, I will wear, super casual things. We'll have like social events, things like that, like pull up to, the common spaces, big posters saying like, hey, this is who we are. If you're interested, we just have pizza, which is a bunch of guys. Like if you were to miss every ad, miss every little thing that, we have merch and things like that. If you're not seeing any of that, we just look like we're a bunch of like 20-year-olds hanging out. And I think that's the most important thing, that we are just kind of young kids, a very intersectional group, right? Like we have, like black men, Hispanics, Asians, it like the whole nine yards. It's something that's totally open and accessible. And when you look at it that way, it's just like, hey, we're just a big friend group at the end of the day. So when it comes to approaching people, I think there's a little bit of like intelligence that comes in, where if we see people who are sitting alone or something like that at an event, or very clearly out of it, or maybe there's somebody in our classes that we see might be having a hard time, that emotional know it how to be able to interact with them tastefully and intelligently. And it's definitely tricky because people don't like feeling called out, but they also don't want to feel like people don't care for them. So it's an issue of how can you approach them without making them feel like people are noticing me, right? If I'm sitting here and I am lonely, and then someone comes up to talk to me about it, I don't want to feel like people are putting pressure on me and they're like, oh wait, I actually am perceiving you as lonely. So it's that organic piece of being like, hey, like I want friends. I honestly like I mean it earnestly. And I feel like I've had a lot of conversation with guys in like the club that's in it with me, who are like, like sometimes I feel like you can be not disingenuous. I don't think anyone's ever accused me of that. But in sense like, hey, like I feel like this is a little fraudulent. Like there's no way you want to be friends with all of us. And I truly do mean it. When I look at every single person, I want to get to know them, and I want to know how we can help, because it's not about me helping them, right? That's not my goal. It's not my thesis as a person. It's like, how can I get to know you, and how do you become part of my community, and how do we build a bigger community for more people and help more people and get them involved too?
I think if I could just add, if that's okay, that on the RA front, and I'm thinking of some of the trainings we've done through RA 101 or RA 201, helping the RAs pay attention, which I know their laundry list of things to do is so long and ever growing, but just having that awareness. Who do they see regularly and who do they not see? What are some of these low risk ways to get people involved? If there's a sports team on campus, can you host a watch party where it's just coming? It's not having to have a forced interaction or something that someone may not be comfortable with as much if they're not as outgoing, but some of those more low risk activities. And then some basic training in how to actively listen if someone does come and want to up a conversation or has a concern. How can you help the RAs practice some of those basic active listening, asking follow-up questions that strike that balance of showing the interest and care, but not going too overboard, especially if it's someone that they don't have a strong relationship with?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I also think about whenever I was a RD, and then even now as a professor, I teach mainly online and in a Zoom format. And one of the things I try to intentionally do is not be the sole arbiter of community, right? It's like it shouldn't be all on my shoulders. It shouldn't all be on the RD or RA shoulders either. So how are we teaching them skills to build a web of support for students, right? So I always emphasize that when you're particularly with my students, I was like, yeah, I care for you, but you need to care for each other as well because we're in this community together and finding ways for them to do that. Well, a question that I kind of wanted to pose to you all too, kind of based off of the trellis strategies outcomes, I just thought it was really interesting that I never thought to put together basic needs and the loneliness thing, but after you think about it, it really does make sense. But it's from more of a systemic level, right? So if I was a first gen student, worked a couple jobs, did all the things, right? You just don't have time, right? And so like if you're constantly going from one job to the other, you're in survival mode all the time, then of course, like one, you don't have motivation to make friends, and two, like other people could view you in a certain way, right? Where it's like, well, they're just busy all the time. I'm not going to get to know them if they're always away. So, like, from your perspectives, like either on the micro 101 level or systemic level, how can we start bringing those folks to the table, right? I was like, those folks that are like super busy because they're just surviving.
I think a lot of it is, I think, you mentioned source of community in class. I think it's giving people the opportunity to hopefully make education a little bit more communal. And I know that's more of an academic affairs thing, probably than a residential life thing. But I mean, I do think a lot of higher education, in order to adequately adapt to the needs of the workforce, especially as, AI emerges, I think there's going to be a much larger need for people skills, for teamwork, for leadership, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of that gets fostered through opportunities of participating in and leading in communities. And so I think, if it's a big picture issue and it's hard to necessarily effectuate like a pointed change on this per se, but like the opportunity for students to just simply get to know their peers within the classroom. But I also do think that there is a lot of value in, looking at using residential life as a launch pad, to kind of your question before of how do you maintain those relationships? I think it's just, simply looking at people as peers and starting with acknowledging people. I think so often in today's college campus, people, just kind of look at their phones and go about their business and, block out a lot of the noise. And so I think, even things as little as, addressing people in the hallway. I mean, something that kind of surprised me when I came down to Texas from Massachusetts was like, A, Southern hospitality is very real, but B, it doesn't have to be big. Like just, you know, building I live off campus. Most UT students, over majority of them do live off campus in kind of our own little neighborhood. And like, you'll just say hi to people in the building that you're in the morning. And it kind of took me by surprise by first. I'm not gonna lie. It took a little of adjusting to social up at 7:30 in the morning. But I think little things like that certainly go a long way.
Yeah, it's funny. My husband's from Syracuse, and he always would pick on me when we first started dating because I smile at everybody, like passing on the street. And he's like, why do you smile at folks?" I was like, "I don't know. It's just what we do down here, I guess." But so I can appreciate that, Carson. Any other perspectives on that?
I can go. Um, I think something that's coming up for me too as I listen about the crossover between basic needs and loneliness is also thinking about the accessibility of opportunities to connect for students and what are those barriers in the way. So one that was addressed is time, right? If a student has 3 on-campus jobs that they're going to support themselves. They clearly have a time barrier, but then there's also a financial barrier in there too, that can cross over with time, right? Do these students not have time for anything that they're not maybe getting compensated for, and then not have the means to pay student organization dues, especially dues for opportunities like Greek life, for example, that can be rather expensive, or other opportunities that are also expensive that could foster connection among the participants. And so, thinking about, I think, just entry barriers to entry for these opportunities, especially as residence life folks, of like, what free programming are you putting on? And then going above and beyond and being like, can we provide food at this program, and not just snacks, but is there a meal we could provide, right? Is there and like a nutritional meal, or could we host events, in partnership with the dining halls and let it be free for students who don't have a meal plan to come in and have a meal like during this programming? So thinking about kind of providing some of that sustenance during the programs could maybe make these students say, okay, it's valid if I go. And yes, from our perspective as like people involved in mental health, it's very valid if they go to any of these events, because we know how much mental health can impact all of these sectors of well-being and how much students could benefit from this. But in their minds, they might need their physical basic needs to be taken care of in order to justify spending time doing something. And if they're not getting paid, what else could there be there? So I think just some ways, other ways that I've seen students kind of help with these barriers, especially through their institute projects, through the Mental Health Advocacy Institute this past year, is we had a student at the University of Central Florida pinpoint the issue of accessibility to her student organizations on campus, and noticed that most of the website links that were given on the student involvement website were either broken or links, or they weren't populated. And so when a student said, yeah, you know what, I'm going to make some time to get involved, went on the website, couldn't connect with anyone. So she's working on a policy on her campus with student government and student activities office to try to make it mandatory to have either a working link to be a registered student organization, or a social media link. So give your Instagram, give your GroupMe, give whatever, or at least the contact of a person who can put you into those spaces, right? So making sure that when students don't go to this place, they're not met with the resources that they're looking for. We have another student at the University of Houston who got funding from her library. She got $15,000 to make third spaces in the library that are Zen rooms, where you just go in there and focus on your mental health. And they're renovating 2 rooms specifically for commuter students to go in to relax and have a place to not only relax, but then socialize with other people and be around other students while they're on campus. And then finally, we had a student with a unique idea, I thought, from Ohio Northern University, who's really involved with Circle K, and got a partnership between Active Minds and Circle K, the service organization, together to go do community service, specifically with international students and transfer students, to introduce them to the community, like the local community, because of studies that have shown that community service or doing volunteer work increases positive mental health. And so looking at that, I think just focusing on what volunteering could we do together and what could we provide to students who volunteer, knowing that that has a social aspect to it. What third spaces could we promote? And then how can we lower the barriers to entry for students who want to get involved and not make it so difficult?
Well, I know we're approaching time, so I have one maybe close up question before I send it back to Linda for some housekeeping. Does that sound good to everybody? Wonderful. So our folks are taking away something super tangible. What is one thing that you think that our audience could do today or tomorrow to start combating loneliness on their campus? And while you're thinking, I'll start. So I think for me, particularly those of us that in the room that might be mid-level or senior professionals in the group, I think that tracking and advocacy is going to be really important, because I think that oftentimes in residence life we feel that we're doing everything all at once for everybody, right? But I think that bringing other folks to the table at the senior level is really important. How can we start addressing this stuff systemically so it's not down to the RDs, the RAs, your programming level folks to have to make up for other parts of the campus, right? How are we doing this at a higher level, and how can residence life take a leadership seat at that table? So, who else?
Kind of just stole my answer I was thinking of there, but I think it's honestly just being an advocate. I think y'all have a very valued position in the university because of how wide-reaching residential life is, and so I think being able to amplify things that you're seeing go well on your campus or learning from other campuses and advocating within your own administration to bring different programs or policies that support student mental health and well-being to your own campus, I think is a great way. Definitely not an easy way. I mean, I recognize that y'all have incredibly busy jobs and big portfolios to manage. But I do think that it's very worthwhile, and know that if you're taking, time during your lunch hour on a Tuesday to do this, that you care about this issue. And so, really appreciate you doing that. And my really takeaway would be to be an advocate and be a champion of this issue on and beyond your campus.
Yeah, and I would just, I think there's a lot that we can do better. And I think one of the things that institutions and organizations are increasingly doing better at is realizing that like students aren't always going to present as students first. Students have a lot going on in their lives. That might be, caregiving, that might be providing financial support back to their parents. For institutions that have family housing, they could be parents themselves. And so just really acknowledging that sometimes students are here to learn, but they are not, being a student might not be their top priority. And that isn't through some individual fault of the student. And so they can make ends meet and support their families while they're in school. And so just making sure that we're acknowledging that their identity might not always be a student first, and that, it's really important to think through policies and procedures and practices on your campuses that might need to be reimagined to reflect the complexity of students' lives beyond the classrooms and beyond the residence hall.
I will give a super tangible answer and suggest that everybody have free food events. And not only do like college students just love food, that's just a fact of life is being 20, but I think it's a great way to engage people in that sense, right? Like I personally am drawn to being like, oh, like there's free pizza over there, let me go. And then all of a sudden I'm getting, pitched somebody's club 20 times over. And right, like I love to make a joke about it, but like in my club that like seeks to sincerely connect with people, our most popular events are the ones where we show up to a common room somewhere, have pizza, people are like, oh, I want pizza, and will talk to us. And that's kind of the aim there. I think that like especially in me observing like what my RA does with like my residential, I go to a Jesuit school, so my residential ministers and things like that. When I'm most meaningfully interacting with people is honestly when they have free food and things like that. So I think it's a like a way of kind of breaking bread with people per se. And I think that's a great way to just grab people's attentions. And then all of a sudden you're eating cookies, eating pizzas, and having like a 20-30 minute long conversation with some people around you. So I think that's a really great way to get people involved and feeling like they're part of a bigger community.
And I'll round it out by saying just decreasing those barriers to entry for opportunities to connect and to make community. Try to even the playing field for all students to engage in those opportunities as much as possible.
Right. Well, I can't thank the five of you enough for being here, for taking time out of your day. And for those of you that are on the webinar or are listening to this after the fact, thank you for taking the time. I think we're all so committed to creating the kind of environment that our students can be successful and feel like they belong. And so these strategies to talk about those that maybe are not feeling that connection and what we can do to support them and get them connected and feel less lonely. This is a topic that could not be more timely. So if you're listening to this later, or even this summer, if you have a few extra minutes after move out, I am going to put in the chat, and I will also send around with the recording, is our YouTube channel. And we put all of our webinars on YouTube. And even just the course of 2025 and 2026, there are some really good ones out there that you can come back and revisit. And like this one, you can share with your colleagues. So good luck with Move Out and the end of the semester. Dylan and Carson, for you two in particular, I hope that that the semester ends on a high note. Very happy to have you all with us today, and good luck, everyone, and hope to see you in Orlando in June. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.